Episodes number 48 through 56 are encore presentations of some of the earlier shows. Here's why. Those early shows were full of foundational information, and I want to make sure you get a chance to hear them again. We're building a new life here, and the new foundation matters. If your reaction is to skip these encores, listen to this first. When you learn something new, 50% of it is gone from your awareness within an hour. That jumps to a loss of 70% within 24 hours and 90% is lost within the week. Add to that during the course of listening to something, your mind wanders a bunch of times. You hear something and your mind takes you on a little rabbit trail until you find yourself coming back to the show. All good. We all do it. Based on that, I'm willing to bet the next few episodes, though repeats, are going to feel brand spanking new to you. And isn't that awesome? Number 57 will be back to original content. So enjoy the shows. Okay, so... This is the Unleash Your Life podcast, where you're going to learn to rewild yourself. I'm your host, Lane Smith Brown, and I'm a best-selling author and rewilding guide. And over the last 20 years, I've been guiding women back to their truest selves. You see, you were born wild with all the wisdom you will ever need to navigate your life in a beautiful and powerful way. Then, just like everyone else on the planet, you got tamed as you fell under the power and influence of others who were also tamed. All that taming you got as a kid has you convinced you are less powerful than you really are. I call all of that unconscious programming power leaks. And on this show, you're going to discover yours, and then you're going to choose to plug them so you can get back to the wild, wise, and powerful being that you are. So grab a coffee, glass of wine, or a favorite friend, or all three, and let's talk about what living your wild self can mean for you. Hello and welcome to the show. I am Lane Smith Brown, and this is episode number 11 of the Unleash Your Life podcast. And today our conversation is around why what happened, and how you can redeem the past. If you've been listening, the last couple of episodes might have been a bit rough if you're still living in an old story, especially if the story you're remembering has a villain lurking somewhere. My father came to this country when he was around 6 years old. His parents fled in the middle of the night from a country they loved to a new one they did not know. My grandfather became a farmer because that was the condition for how he was to gain safe and legal entry to this new land. He managed to do quite well, even though it wasn't his skill set or his dream. He had a young wife and a young son, and they were dropped in the middle of nowhere, without friends or family, and none of them spoke the language. There's not a lot that my father talks about from his kidhood. But I know every time his father got angry, it was my dad who got the brunt. And he was often left behind the barn, unconscious and beaten, only to be retrieved by his mother when the sun went down and it was safe for her to bring him into the house. I know my dad was creative, sensitive, a dreamer. Most of my memories are of him trying to make a success of himself. Maybe the result of clearly never being able to please his own father. He was a pretty absent dad for me, and not easy to please. But to his credit, he never laid a hand on his kids in anger or frustration, even though he could have easily repeated his father's behavior. My mother was the oldest of 7, and her mother checked out when her youngest was born. My grandmother struggled with what they thought was mental illness, but later I would learn was just a profound disconnection and unhappiness with the life she had been obligated to participate in. And by that I mean marriage and kids. So that disconnected mother gave my mother her own children to raise. And my mom's memories of her kidhood were changing diapers, feeding and caring for 6 siblings. Add to that all she wanted to do was play. It just makes it all the sadder. The boys got to horse around with the baseball and skating, and every time she tried to jump in, my grandfather would say it was inappropriate for girls to do such things. Now, she wasn't the nurturing kind of mom some of you may have had, but she kept us safe and well fed, and is likely why I associate good food with love. And so, 2 kids who had never had their own needs met married after only 4 weeks of formal dating, which simply means visiting in a living room together with a whole family around you. And together, those 2 little kids started a family of their own. All right, now, I'm assuming you've been with me for a bit, so you know if we haven't done our work to grow ourselves up, we walk around the world like we're still around 7 years old. Everything that happens is filtered through the immature ego who just wants everything to be exactly the same as it used to be, or for all those longings they had as kids to finally be met. Neither of them had the skill set to be what they or others needed them to be. They floundered from moment 1, and neither of them did anything to change that. And it wasn't fun for any of us. But they lasted 50 years, because that's just what you did back then. My dad chose to never be home, and my mother, by the time I came around, had nothing left to give. So I felt like I raised myself. Now, there were some benefits to that, to be sure, but a good cuddle now and again would have also been pretty nice. Long story short, it all turned out well for me in the end, and we'll get to the how and the why of that in a bit. So unless you've been really, really lucky, most of you came from generations of ancestors who never got what they needed and never did the work to grow themselves up. So they never got to stand in their authentic power. It's a bit of a miracle if you got parents who had their shit together. And if you had that, count your lucky stars, because that's amazing, and I'm truly happy for you. Now, it's not like my kidhood was awful. My parents did what was expected. My father did his best to provide, and my mother did her best to make a home and keep us safe and fed. But we all know we need a little bit more than that, don't we? All right, so through all of my 20s, I ranted and railed against the injustice of it all. I kept wanting my childhood to be different. If only this, and if only that. After all of my problems were a direct result of my parentage. None of it was about me, right? When I finally realized that they were doing the best they could with the tools they had, I was able to let them off the hook. And I got back to that whole reason I came onto the planet. And that was to do my work, to uncover who I came to be. So that's what I did. And my life took off in a really, really good way. When I was in my mid-40s, my mom had a stroke. And through an unexpected set of synchronicities, I chose to take her home. But instead of having the distant mom I grew up with, she was now the little girl she came into the world to be. She was joyful and happy, filled with wonder, and she would light up whenever Callie or I walked into the room. For 6 months, I got to see this joyful creature be who she came to be. No judgment, just love. And then she was gone. Living as if something could be said or done to change what happened in the past is such an act in futility. I cannot tell you how much freedom there is in accepting the fact that your parents and caregivers are all a part of why you are the way you are. That goes for the stuff you think is terrible and bad, all the way to the things you think are wonderful and good, and everything in between. I believe we chose the exact place we landed because of the tools we needed to acquire for this round in our experience. And how you grew up is a part of that process. So we can get caught up in regret and blame, or we can recognize our caregivers and influencers' limitations and ensure that we do our own work so the buck stops with us. As you look around right now at many of the world leaders, the rise of nationalism and so much them and us everywhere you turn, can you not see every one of them as these little lost 7-year-olds with way too much power and responsibility on their hands? Just scared little kids trying desperately to be noticed and validated. And they are being followed by more lost little 7-year-olds trying desperately to fit in and belong. Goodness. Imagine humans doing their work and then from that grown-ass woke state raising others or expecting others to do the same. We can change our world in such a significant way with this attitude, and it begins with you and me. You might think this is just personal work, but imagine more and more of us living from a state of connection and purpose. Well, that's my dream anyway, and I'd like our end goal to be world peace. Because if you're going to dream, make it good. What I'm wanting you to get here is that there are so many people using their past as an excuse to fail or flounder, when you could just as easily choose to use those experiences to propel you forward. Staying in a state of wishing the past could be changed is an kind of a zero-end game or a zero-sum game. It doesn't get you anywhere. Name one thing that has happened to you that you can change. Just one thing. But how much time and energy have you spent dreaming about going back in time and changing what you've said or done, or what someone else said or did? Making peace with it offers you strength and power. Move on. It gives you the energy to create the life you came to live. Callie so eloquently often says, if you're an asshole at 3, it's your parents. But if you're an asshole at 33, that's on you. Yes, I know. She could be a poet, and maybe she was one in her past life. But the sentiment is true, don't you think? We can't keep blaming something that happened way back when on why we're still stuck today. For many, the benefit of holding on to the pain is that they have an excuse to not move on. Have you ever met someone who can't form a healthy relationship because their parent or caregiver was an alcoholic or distant or unloving or critical or not exactly what they needed them to be? They're now 37 and still either avoiding relationships at all costs or finding themselves with people who bring out all those childhood feelings. You know, familiar equals safe. And the cycle of disconnection continues. Or someone constantly struggles at work or with making money, and they're still blaming their childhood instruction for all that's wrong in their life now. I didn't learn the skills when I was young. Therefore, I'm stuck with whatever I learned to believe. And that's one of the biggest lies going. And that's why so many people simply drift through their life, taking what they can get and settling. Funny how following traditional expectations of getting a job, getting married, and having kids is often called settling down. We've been conditioned through generations to lower our expectations in all sorts of places. Where have you lowered yours? Look, I did that for years and years. And stuff can still show up now and again, where I'm using old shit as an excuse to not move forward on something. Although I didn't follow a traditional path of marriage and kids, I still drifted nonetheless. And I did that by shutting my ears every time my intuition tried to whisper in my ear that I am meant for more. Now, this is not an indictment of any kind. If you're recognizing that you've been stuck or drifting, it's just a call to notice when you're doing it and declaring that you're a grown-ass woman and you can learn to do things differently. You can become different and expect different of both yourself and others. But man, what if you can't let go? Indulge me in another story, okay? Kelly and I used to live in the country. The property came with a whole bunch of outbuildings. They had a purpose at one time, but we just wanted the yard to be clean and tidy. So we slowly began the process of tearing them down. We redeemed the brittle barnwood where we could and burned the rest. All in all, we took down 17 old buildings that had once served the previous owners well, but didn't serve us. There was one building, however, that we were reluctant to let go of. It housed the electrical supply for the pump house, which was the only way we could get water to the house or to the horse barn. And it was in good enough shape to retain as a garage. Quite a few years back now, a surprise storm came through our area. The accompanying 100-kilometer-hour winds blew through the yard and started to lift a corner of the garage. We quickly put on our jackets and headed out to see what we could do. First, we parked the car in a safer place, and second, tried to come up with some sort of a plan to keep the structure from taking off. As we stood in a bit of a daze, we were aware of how many times we had thought to move the electrical panel to the power pole right next to the garage. It would have been an infinitely more stable spot for such an important service. Yet, as with so many messages, we just let other things take priority. Now we ran the risk of having that electrical wiring ripped haphazardly from the panel, leaving us with no water, no power, and no heat. Never mind the danger of having a wire swinging precariously above the tall grasses and very dry wood. That day, we did all we could think of to make the area safe. To secure the building, we ended up attaching a very heavy winching strap from the rafters to the body of our old truck. For about 2 hours, that strap held. But as the gusts of wind swelled and dissipated and then swelled again, the strap began to stretch and sag. It required several adjustments over the course of the storm to ensure that everything held tight. We stood at the window of our porch waiting for the next cue that we needed to run out and tighten the strap again. In one of those adjustment periods, the wind picked up, the strap snapped, and the garage lifted right off its foundation, jumped back 6 feet, then shifted to the left and finally collapsed in a jumble of twisted wood and metal. The heavy electrical wire had been torn right out of the panel and swung dangerously above our heads, spewing big sparks in the powerful wind. Callie ran across the yard to shut off the main power supply to dissipate the immediate danger and came back to where I was standing. In that moment, with the wind still raging and the good enough garage lying in a heap, we realized that we were hanging on to something that no longer served us. The truth of it was, the worst part was the hanging on. Once it was gone, it felt like a relief. Within minutes, we had a solution for how we were going to manage without water until the electrical could be rerouted, and we immediately appreciated the view of the barn without the obstruction of the garage. Everything in life is a symbol. Every person and every situation offers us an opportunity to learn about ourselves. So I processed the experience during the storm and found myself wondering where else I was hanging on to something that was no longer serving me. Where else was I holding on to the something that was only good enough? It's true. I've gotten rid of all kinds of things in my pursuit to know myself more deeply. But was there a reoccurring thought, habit, tendency, wound, or excuse that I kept around simply because I was too nervous or afraid to let it go? Would I be less inclined to hang on to it if I realized there could be more room in my life for something else? Something that would serve me better? Something more beneficial? More satisfying? More me? Can you think of anything you're holding on to right now that is keeping you from uncovering your authentic power? Can you see what memory you're using as a power leak? Where are you settling for just good enough? If your hands are full of what you don't want and you see something better, what do you need to do? Is it possible to grasp something better without letting go of what you're holding on to? I know we're messing with some big stuff here, and it's going to require courage, tenacity, and a desire to follow through. Good. You're worth the effort. Always keep your eye on the prize, sisters. This is a process of deliberately choosing, constantly listening to your inner voice and outer voice for clues on old shit that's still hanging on. Sometimes that just requires a little tweaking, and sometimes it requires hiring a moving truck to haul that shit to the dump. But I'll tell you this. The more you're willing to get rid of the stuff that you've been using as an excuse for where you currently are, the quicker you can get to creating the life you came to live. Your intuition wants to guide you. And you may have old stories mulling around in your mind that drown out that voice. I'm not strong enough, or smart enough, or lucky enough. No one ever showed me how. It's too late, and it sounds too hard. I've tried, but it didn't go well, so I quit. It's just easier to drift, so I'll just take what I can get. Look, my life is good enough. I don't really need anything more. And besides, I couldn't make a living or a life following my heart. Or could I? Letting go of all that old conditioning means you are freeing yourself up for something more. What do you think? Are there statements you find yourself saying that are steeped in an old story or an old wound? Is it time to say, I'm a grown-ass woman and I'd like to take my life back, so fuck that old shit? Wouldn't that make a great t-shirt? Look, this is work, to be sure, but offer yourself grace and a sense of humor every chance you get. You did nothing wrong, and no matter what you learned, you can use it to move you back into alignment with yourself. And here's how you can begin the process. Take a look at your life. You know where you're telling an old story? If you don't, ask a good friend. She's been hearing you for years. I'm sure she'll help you out. So write that shit down and work through them one by one. What do you think that experience took from you? And what did it give you? What did it not give you? And how can you give that to yourself? How did it hurt you? And how can you heal you? If you wished it had been different, what are you willing to do to redeem it? Those are great questions. I hope you wrote them down. Yep, not easy. But this is what we all must do in order to be the queens. You know, historically, in ancient wisdom communities, a king or queen was the holder of wisdom. They were the spiritual leaders and were able to care for, guide, and lead those who were their responsibility. Does that scare the shit out of you? Or will you rise to the occasion? Oh, don't think you have to be on stage in front of a crowd or on a world tour of some kind. It could simply mean having a positive influence on those around you by being an example of a woman living in her authentic power. If all of this sounds impossible this moment, then just begin with forgiveness. As hard as this might be to believe, if you're still living as your 6 or 7-year-old self, whoever hurt you from their pain. It felt personal, but it wasn't. No connected individual purposefully hurts another being. It doesn't mean it wasn't painful, but holding on to something that is no longer happening is an absolute waste of your time and energy. Let it go. Forgive who needs to be forgiven and get on with building your life. If you don't even know where to begin, I get it. So here's a hint. There is a Polynesian practice that has gained a great deal of attention lately, and it's all about forgiveness. And it's called, now bear with me here, Ho'oponopono. And it goes like this. Picture the person or the situation that is separating you from you, and simply say these 4 lines over and over again as a mantra. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. This is about giving you freedom, not them. And you're talking to your authentic self here because you've let this experience separate you from your truth. I'm sorry. Please forgive me. Thank you. I love you. I hope that feels like a warm bath, a comforting, well-deserved rest with a titch of anticipation for what can happen when you truly let go of what's holding you back. There's a gift in everything, sisters. Look for it. On that note, I'm going to call it a show. I'll meet you back here next time. Eventually, I may set up a schedule for these, but for now, I'm just going with the flow. So if you want a reminder when the next show drops, just subscribe. You're brilliant and beautiful, and you can do this. Bye for now. Well, I hope this show rocked your world a little bit. If you want additional resources, check out the links in the show notes or at lanesmithbrown.com. Before you go, please subscribe to this podcast. It's how we get these tools into the world, and this world needs more wild women standing in their authentic power. Do that for me, will ya? Thank you.